Good afternoon, and I hope you've had a great morning. Welcome back to after your lunch break. Hope you got some great networking in, or you got a time just to kind of take a break and creatively refuel. Welcome to First Base. This is going to be an amazing panel. I just feel it. But before we get into our discussion and I introduce our guest, I'd like to give you just a little bit of boilerplate reminders here. You probably heard this before, but I just want to remind you that if you have questions during the session, please use the chat function that's at the bottom of your Zoom screen. It says Q&A, and we'll be getting to attendees' questions for our panelists in the latter half of our session. Also, if you feel like you might be in the wrong session, or there's a session you're curious about, or how to get to a session later, you can go to your program, and in the program there are links for those sessions right next to the session descriptions. If you have a one-on-one pitch with an agent or mentoring session that's scheduled, please arrive 10 minutes ahead of time before your scheduled time at the provided link in the one-on-one room. That way our team can check you in. And I've said this before, and you've probably heard it elsewhere, but we really mean it here at Broadleaf. Congratulations for taking that step. We really believe in you, and that's awesome. You're taking the time to do that. Our official bookseller for the conference is Foxtail Books. So yay, they're coming back. At Foxtail, there are titles by our guest writers and also our own recommended titles on writing, such as Stephen King's On Writing and other books about craft that can be found on the bookstore page and on our website. That link will be available in the chat and also in our program. Foxtail will be also hosting an in-person event on October 22nd at 1 p.m. featuring several of our panelists, several of our guests, additional guests. It's called Author Palooza, and it's getting huge. I think we're like at 12 now, and it's going to be amazing. So please come and check that out. You enjoyed our Broadleaf chat at lunch today. We're going to be doing that again tomorrow in the one-on-one room. So if you missed it today or you enjoyed today, you can come back tomorrow. Also, we're offering pre-registration for next year's conference. As Zach said in his introduction, we are going to go back to our roots. We're going to be at the Decatur Library. We are super pumped about it, very excited, and we're also looking forward to seeing you face-to-face once again and having that interaction. But thank you so much for coming to our virtual conference. We are excited to have you, and I want to remind you that it's a good time to renew your registration to Broadleaf, to register for Broadleaf. You can do that when you pre-register, and also if you would like to make a donation, because we are a nonprofit, we are very dependent on donations to keep going and offer our services. Please look at our website donation page, and that's where you can donate. And I'm happy to answer any questions about that. So just drop me a Q&A and I'll point you in the right direction. So I think that's all of our boilerplates. I'd like to move on to the fun stuff now. We are introducing our guests for today's panel. Our first guest up is Marlena Frank. She is the author of young adult fantasy and horror novels, including several books that have hit the bestseller list. Her work has been praised in Reader's Favorite and featured in the Mode of Literature magazine. She is a Georgia native. She has been writing and publishing short fiction since 2010. She's an affiliate member of the Atlanta chapter of the Horror Writers Association, Woot Woot, and she is an active member of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Association. She's an avid member of the Atlanta cosplay community, and her and her sister do amazing cosplay, so check them out online, Instagram, great stuff. And she lives with her sister and their two spoiled adopted cats. So, and her cats are great too. So welcome, Marlena.
Thank you.
Our next guest is Shaun Hamill. Shaun received his BA in English from the University of Texas, Arlington, his MFA from the Iowa Writers Workshop. His debut novel, A Cosmology of Monsters, was published at Pantheon in September 2019. His fiction has appeared in Carve magazine, Carve, Tour Night Fires, Come Join Us by the Fire, and his nonfiction has appeared in Crime Reads and Tour Night Fire. He lives in Arlington, Texas, and he is on edits for his second novel. And spoiler, he started writing his third. So very exciting. So welcome, Shaun.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And our next guest is Piper Huguley, and she is a writer of historic fiction. Her debut was in June 2022. Congratulations. With By Her Own Design, a novel of Anne Lowe, fashion designer to the social register. And this is with William Morrow Publishing. It's a novel about Anne Lowe, who was the Black fashion designer of Jackie Kennedy's wedding dress. She is also the author of Sweet Tea by Hallmark Publishing and the author of 2 historical romance series, Migrations of the Heart, about the Great Migration, and Home to Milford College. She blogs about the history behind her novels at her website, piperhuguley.com, and she lives in Atlanta with her husband and her son. Welcome, Piper. So, y'all, I'm very excited about this session, and I have to share with the guests, the attendees to our panel, that when we were planning this, and we're kind of emailing back and forth, several of us were like, why are we on this panel exactly? Do they know what kind of thing we write? So, which to me makes that even more awesome. So I am going to just start really with a softball and say, when do you think in your own writing there's a sex scene that is necessary? And how far do you go? It can be a love scene too. It doesn't have to be just sex or love.
So
scene.
for me, I think a nice romance scene or something that's intimate is needed whenever, first of all, if the plot has a good spot for it, you don't want to just shoehorn it in. You know, you want it to be during a lull or a break between action. Like, so I write a lot of action scenes and stuff. So you don't want it to be like in the middle of that. You want it to be at a decent lulling point. And usually it's a good idea to include it whenever you want, to allow your characters to rekindle whatever relationship that they have, if that's been strained or if they're just, you know, starting to get close to one another, that sort of thing.
Oh, okay. So not just thrown in there to spice things up, but
not, yeah, my opinion is no.
So it's not just spicing, as our title would say, it's actually character development and plot. It's like, okay, all right. So Piper, you said, do they read my books? But there's got to be, I mean, there's romance in your book. So how do you deal, first off, let's start, how do you deal with sex in your books?
I don't. See, that's the thing. It's
Okay.
like there are no sexy times in my books. As a genre, historical fiction tends not to deal with sexy times. So just as a genre, that's not there. And there are people who are beginning to grapple with that. And sort of wondering, and there is something I'm beginning to think about in terms of my next historical fiction project, but it's still not the sexy times to that point. But in terms of romance, my romance is very much along, and this is in the romance world known as Romancelandia. This is a lot of terms, you know, that are not acceptable, that people would use, but feel they're degraded. I mean, they're just terms for what I do, but I tend to think of it as sweet. For people who watch the Hallmark Channel, for whom I've published one book for their publishing arm, you know that the culmination of a Hallmark movie is the kiss. And for sure, when I put forward my synopsis to write Sweet Tea for Hallmark Publishing, I had 3 kisses, and that was too many.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, so the 2 of them had to go, and the 1 kiss had to remain at the end. And even as people think about this or deal with it, the way that I think about it is, for people who write sweet as I do, that the kiss is the sex act of the sweet world. So then you have to have a certain kind of build up to that, just as you have built up the sex scenes. And I can talk more about that, but that's my introductory way of thinking about it in terms of that, and the engagement that I had with it. My two other series that you mentioned are self-published, but also there's nothing more than kissing in those.
Oh, Piper, that is, I'm glad we are going to come back to that, because two things I'm thinking about. One, I'm thinking Jane Austen, in classic literature, and two, I'm thinking about when there are severe restrictions on a genre, like what you're talking about, how much that can really fuel creativity. You know, you have those restrictions, so you've got to figure out how that kiss is going to be worth something at the end. So we're going to come back to that. So, okay. Shaun, so how do you deal with romance or sex in your books? Because they wouldn't on the surface maybe look like they would have that in them. Like Cosmology of Monsters is monster. It's also family drama or saga, fantasy, a little bit of horror, gothic. So it's like it's a wonderful genre mix. But where do you find romance and sex in your book?
Well, I mean, I think with Cosmology, it's really, I mean, underneath all the things you just mentioned, it's really like 3 love stories at its core. And for me, so much of that book was about things we don't talk about, the secrets we keep, the family shame, all of that. And sex, of course, is tied up in all of that. And I think for the book that I was writing, it would have been dishonest not to engage honestly with sex in a very frank way. You know, there are scenes in the book that were in and out because we tried it without, because there's one scene in particular that sort of pushes the envelope. It's a scene about halfway through the book that either you're on board or you're really not. Like, I'm either going to lose you or you're in for the rest of the book. And we tried the book without it and it didn't work. Like, it turned out like, no, we need this scene. This is a crucial stepping stone in the relationship between these two characters that gets you from, you know, more of like say a friendship or Calvin and Hobbes sort of, you know, relationship between kid and monster and two people who are falling in love. And so it really felt necessary. And I think it's something that I think about a lot in terms of my writing. You know, so I think in the same way that it would be disingenuous to have, you know, lots of sex scenes in a Hallmark book, I think it would have been disingenuous not to have those scenes in a Cosmology of Monsters. You know, it's just sort of what the book needs.
And we're going to come back to maybe, well, actually, no, I don't want to come back. I want to follow up real quick here. You said that there was a discussion between, was it you and your editor about it going in and going out? Did anybody raise a red flag with it and say you can't have that, or was that your personal decision? Could you kind of walk us through? I know I don't want to spoil because that's such an important moment, exactly what happens in it, but it is that scene between the lead and the monster. So.
Right. So yeah, there's a sort of a sexual awakening scene that's not actual sex, but that's very sex adjacent and very frankly sexual. About halfway through the book, and it was something. So I had 2 editors. I had my main editor, the person who acquired the book, and that person's assistant, who was basically co-editing the book. And my editor just felt like it was he thought it was just a little too much, a little too far. I had questions about it. I mean, we played with it a lot. Like the version of the book that I sold had a more lengthy and extreme version of the scene that I trimmed down to something closer to what's in, you know, the book now. And he was still uncomfortable with it. because it's a weird scene, right? And so if you can do the book without that scene, then maybe the book's financial chances are a little better, or you're less likely to alienate the reader. And we took it out in one draft, and the assistant editor, thank God, was like, this isn't working anymore because of this scene. Like, this is the bridge between these, in this relationship. And even then it went back, but when the book was supposedly done being edited, when it was being launched internally at the publisher, where they're getting ready for the marketing push and all of that, somebody on the board at Pantheon still came back and was like, look, can you tone this down a little more? And so I went back one more time, and we really massaged it so that in the scene, it becomes less about, I think in the original version of that scene, it read a little more predatory. And what we went back and did was made it so that something happened that neither character was anticipating. And the monster is trying to help in the way that it can, which fortunately or unfortunately, sort of takes on the form of this sexual moment. But it's not something that was done to the character on purpose anymore. And I think once we figured that out, suddenly the scene finally just, it just like fell into place and clicked. But it was the very last thing I was working on in the book before it was published. So, I mean, it was a lot of work to get to the right place with it. And I'm really happy with where it is now. I think it's the best version of the scene, but I do feel a little ashamed that it took so much work to find what should have been like a no duh kind of thing, but
no, I think it was a tough thing you're trying to do. So it's interesting, that process. And I want to take what you were talking about, Shaun, and flip back over to Piper real quick. You said that when you pitched to Hallmark, and you're used to writing, would it be cozy romance, sweet romance, kind of old fashioned romance, sweet? So for them to say 3 kisses, too many,
and she can't look at his butt.
And she can't look at his butt. Wow. So, so
butt looking.
Where in the process did that happen, Piper? And who told you that?
This was the very beginning, because I was permitted to submit. Before I was permitted to submit with just a synopsis because of my previous books. They knew I could write a book. So the synopsis was submitted, and it was put through to the production company in case that I didn't know that this was a thing with their publishing company, that in case they're going to adapt it for a movie, it goes, the synopsis, the idea must be filtered through the production company. So it was the production company who made these notes, gave them to my editor, and my editor came back and let me know, take out 2 kisses, take out the butt looking, and we'll make you an offer.
So did that affect plot?
Not really. Yeah, not really. What I had sort of forgotten about in terms of Hallmark, and part of that, what I call the hierarchical build-up to the kiss, is things like the almost kiss, which if you watch a lot of Hallmark movies, then you'll recognize that there's usually an almost kiss that leads to that, as well as some other things. So I hadn't, in the synopsis, layered in some of those things a little more. I just, went for it. So it wasn't that difficult to swap out, certain things like that for that particular reason.
When I want to swing back over to Marlena, because with both Shaun and Piper, they've got their story ideas, and both of them are working kind of in concert with these other outside authorities beyond just really an editor. I didn't know about the Pantheon that came back, and then the production company that you were dealing with. That's fascinating with Hallmark. But Marlena, you've got a lot of control over your fiction as an indie author. So you're making these calls. Are they made basically your calls? Are there beta reader feedback on some of this? Or is this, how do you make these kinds of decisions? What rules do you put forth for yourself?
Well, so it's interesting because in the Stolen series, when I wrote that, most of the driving force of the plot that you find out as you read is two gay fairies that are like having a lover's quarrel in the background. And that is basically why all of the terrible things are happening in Chalet's world when she's pulled into this land. And you know, I never had any pushback from the small press I went with that. There was no issue with it whatsoever. And then now when I'm going through and I'm now in the process of self-publishing my Wolves of Kanta series, you know, it's young adult, and young adult can get very spicy these days. I personally try not to let it get to that point. I keep it fairly sweet. I keep it not quite to the one kiss only that you're having to deal with, Piper, with some of the stories you're writing with. But you know, there's cuddling, there's kissing, there's hugging and stuff. But I don't ever go beyond that too much because I personally don't feel comfortable with that in young adult. But there's plenty of young adult out there that goes beyond that. But everyone writes different kinds of fiction for their own tastes, and that's just my personal taste when I write. So.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's like not so much a rule, but more just a taste, what you feel comfortable with.
Yeah, and you know, my world that I'm creating is so dystopian and just there's horror everywhere that I felt like pulling back on how far the romance goes helps balance that out a little bit, if that makes sense. Because you know, they're literally fighting werewolves and people are getting torn to pieces everywhere. It'd be really strange for me to also just insert a full-blown sex scene in the middle of that or something beyond that in a young adult novel too. So, you know, you have to kind of gauge what you're writing and think of your audience and think of your readers and figure out, okay, what fits what they're expecting and also fits your characters in the world that you're building too. Like my main character in the Wolves of Kanta series was sheltered for most of her life. And she's just now getting to the point where she's able to actually be herself around people more. So, you know, there's just balancing acts all the time that you're doing.
Marlena, that's a great answer because you're just really underscoring the idea that just because you're working in indie and you do have a lot of control over the decisions you make, there's still forces that you as an author feel like you have to answer to with audience, taste, market, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, I'm not working directly. I mean, I have an editor, but you know, that I'm working with, but I'm hiring out for that editor to work on my work. It's not so much someone being like, I know this work, this, you know, the audience and everything. Oftentimes I hear that my work is kind of, it's in the same vein as young adult, but it also is very unique in its own right because of that. So there is some benefit to it, I think.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's interesting. So, and this is a nice jumping off point, Marlena, for the next question that we had kind of talked about in our prep. I'm going to throw this over here to Piper. How does genre, like the romance genre, dictate the way you handle romance? Maybe beyond just the rules of sweet, or could you talk a little bit? Is that always been the genre that you've written in, that kind of subset of romantic?
Yes, and part of the reason I made that decision for several reasons, because when people hear romance, what they think about are the full-fledged sex scenes. That's what they think romance is, rather than the gamut that romance can run from this just kissing kind of thing at the end all the way to, you know, full-blown sex scenes, etc. So part of that was I didn't see any or much representation of the sweet side, or what I also call more or less courting types of aspects of behavior. And when I say courting, I mean that more like hand-holding, kissing, daddy's on the front porch with a shotgun, ain't nothing gonna go down kind of circumstance. Which the thing to be noted about it is it's not that these people don't have any desire with each one another sexually or anything like that. It's just it's quick. Usually sweet stories, when you see them, they take place over a matter of weeks rather than months, because they want to get to the next thing.
Right.
So there is that aspect of it. But yeah, in terms of romance, I just felt that I was going to, you know, sort of carve out a particular niche in terms of having books with Black and in the case of Sweet Tea, my first interracial book, that we're going to go along those lines in terms of it. And it's still the case where, you know, I'm on Twitter a lot and people talk about it, you know, where's the banging, boning, you know, that's what they just would use the terms or whatever. It's like, you know, sometimes I feel like I have to come in and remind people, not all romances have boning, but I don't want to sometimes always be a wet blanket in terms of that.
Right.
But it's the truth. It's like, you know, someone saying in the chat, these things run the full gamut, and just like to remind people that for some, that's what's out there.
So with the restraint that you're having to put in, and this is something that for sure I know, well, that all three of our writers here could probably talk about, is the idea of the kinds of restraints or stops that you put on your romance. Is less more? I guess, Piper, you probably would say yes. Less is more hot.
Less is more hot. I think the effective use of tension is also something that you, and so rather than looking at it as restrictions, I look at it as guidelines to plotting out the intimacy. And I think that's an important word that I tend to use a lot. The intimacy between these characters, and how will it increase, and what aspects of particularly internal and external conflict will prevent that intimacy from happening. I've made use, I do tend to make use in my romances of Desmond Morris's intimate behaviors, which with him as a zoologist, observing behaviors of increasing of how human beings become more intimate. And there's a 12-step thing with it. And it's very interesting that really it's not until the 8th step until you get to actual genital contact between human beings. So you have other places to go for a long time. Almost 2/3 in, there are other things that you can do, right? Up to that. So that's, yeah, that's how I do.
And you're giving the perfect segue over to Shaun, because the famous, I would say famous, not infamous, but the scene that we've been talking about, you said that's halfway through your book. So I guess I know we've talked about plotting versus not structuring, but did you have in your mind that this was probably going to happen and it's the halfway point? Is this about building tension? Just could you talk a little bit about kind of what Piper was talking about this was something that drives her plot to get to that kiss at the end. Was this a drive to the midway point in your book, or am I just imposing that?
No, it's a coming of age story, right? So it made sense contextually within the, you know, the story, that this is where in the character's life this would emerge, because he's, I think, 16 or 15 or 16 when that happens, so that it just made sense. And it's not the first sexual moment in the book. There's at least one before that the character is exposed to something he wasn't supposed to see way too young. That also creates some, you know, I think some trauma that sort of, I think, ends up feeding into the rest of the book. So it's definitely something that I, you know, like Piper said, it's something that, you know, I was charting. I don't know that I necessarily thought like, I'm going to wait till halfway through to have this scene. It's more like, this feels appropriate here. And then looking back, it's like, oh, it's halfway through the book. Okay. You know, I guess that's my subconscious doing the heavy lifting for me in that case. But yeah, I think it's definitely like, it wasn't something that I would have just led with, you know. And in the second book, there's also some sex, and it's very much built around where is it going to have the most emotional impact in the story. So it's something that I definitely keep in mind as I'm working.
Well, and Marlena, you were talking about it would be pretty weird to have some sex scenes like in the dystopian, the the Wolves book series, I mean, people are fighting for their lives there. It's like, oh, let's go behind this shed here, and after we've, murdered.
Yeah.
What? And stop me if y'all think this is off topic, but I'm thinking about expanding this out a little bit about just intimacy. Not just sex or romance, but what does your genre, Marlena, allow you to explore in terms of intimate relationships? It's not just sex and romance, there's other kinds as well. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so young adult has, of course, a wide range of opportunities there, not just sex and romance, but intimacy of all kinds. And that also, you can look at that even with parental figures and people being substitute parental figures in areas. You also can look at, I'm planning a series coming up that's going to have an ace protagonist in it, and she's going to have a boyfriend. And they're not going to ever get to that point at the end of the chart, like you were mentioning, Piper, because that's not what she's interested in. And that's a whole audience as well. So it really depends on who the audience and the genre, and figuring out where on that spectrum you want your book to land and how far do you want to push it. I include in the Wolves of Kansas series right now a lot of that build up, like Piper was mentioning, and Shaun mentioned as well, building up that tension. And each book, it gets a little bit closer and a little bit closer, but once it gets to the point towards the end of the series, I'll make a decision of if that kiss is going to happen or not, that kiss being a metaphor, but but it's all about pacing and monitoring how the tension is building and where you want that to go in the end.
So I think this would be really interesting to our panelists, because you're opening up, Marlena, a really interesting topic here. You have a new protagonist who's ace, but she has a boyfriend.
Mm-hmm.
So, and definitely there's an audience for that. I mean, for my students, I see that there's a hunger for those kinds of different stories. What were some of your considerations with writing that? Like maybe.
Well, I have a friend who is sex repulsed ace, and they went to college, and they had so many people try to convince them that, oh, you just haven't been with the right person yet, and it's like, trying to pressure them into things. And I was like, this is something that needs to have more spotlight on. There needs to be more representation of this, clearly, because there's still a lot of misunderstanding regarding that sort of thing. Again, friends I have in the cosplay community, where I started out at, are much more aware of this and have a lot more of a vocabulary for it. So I don't know. I just feel like there's a need for that going forward.
And it's a way to show people all kinds of intimacy, but also to give some readers that wonderful moment of like, hey, I see myself in your story. Oh, that's awesome. So seeing, I think this is opening up some interesting conversations here that I hope I don't put anybody on the spot. This isn't really what we were planning on talking about, but this idea of seeing yourself or seeing something different in a book. Piper, you said that one of your books was Sweet Tea was your first interracial book. What was the decision behind that? What was it? Why did you decide you wanted to tell that story from that angle? What were you thinking?
Well, Sweet Tea is about, as a lot of Hallmark stories are, a high-powered career woman who has lost her way in the world and must go home to find herself. Kind of thing. But then, in this particular case, her grandmother is a James Beard nominated Southern cook who has a lot of recipes in her knowledge, whatever. And some documentarian dude has come to her town where she works and is filming a film called Southern Treasures, wants the grandmother to be part of it, and decides to co-write a cookbook with her. The heroine, who is an intellectual property lawyer, knowing that recipes are intellectual property, is like, hold up a second. You don't come in taking my grandmother's recipes without my, and there was no other way really to amp the tension and amp the conflict of that story without him being a white man and without the heroine being a Black woman. There's no way to really get the most the maximum tension out of that without them being who they are. And thinking about the central question of that conflict between them. If you are someone who has a heritage and you're not respecting it, does that mean that somebody else from some other world can come in and appreciate it? So that's where the sort of the backdrop to that particular story is. And I'm told that you should have snack spot nearby when you eat it, because there is a lot of discussion in it necessarily.
And to me, what you are so, wow, my mind is blown here. You're taking a genre that you're like, it's sweet, it's entertaining, it's Hallmark, it's cozy, and you're bringing some really weighty issues to that, and still manage to have some romance there.
Yeah, that's what I do.
Was there a moment where there was a question of the story when you were writing it that it would veer maybe away from the sweet into it, like too deep, or did you feel like you had to balance that, or what?
Well, I think that's why they have you write the synopsis first. It's like a pretty lengthy synopsis, in terms of, what it had to be done, so that they could warn you off if you were about to go into some un-Hallmark like territory, which they do.
Right.
And sort of I'm working on subsequent projects with them, and they let you know what is not. That is too heavy for. They will let you know. Back off or find some other way of talking about that. Which is what I tend to do. Like, that theme is gonna come out. It's just not gonna come out in the way that they think it should come out. So, so yeah, it is operating. About my romance stories, as they do operate in that allegorical level. I just think that having people come together in a romance type of way is the most political, it's the heaviest thing that you can do. And especially, I think, with the C word, I don't know if we're allowed to say that or not on here, but with this current pandemic, one of the things I've been thinking about is, oh, thank God, I've been married for like 24 years. I don't know how I would date anybody right now. How would I trust you? I don't know where you've been. It's like, I like to joke as a college professor, the first thing they do when they come to college, they want to rub up against someone else. How do you know where that person has been, or do you don't care, and what does that involve in terms of when you're writing about characters and stuff?
So it's like these elements of trust.
Yes, it is very much the element of trust. I think that was a question that somebody had in terms of these elements and levels and layers of trust. And at least in the romance sense, I think one of the questions had to do with when that trust is broken. There's always that moment at the end or towards the end where for some reason the trust has been violated, and somehow, of course, it has to do with the recipes. Some way the trust has been violated, and how can they build that trust back up, or that the question is supposed to be put enough to the reader's mind that, oh my gosh, this looks really bad, is it gonna ever, and something else has to be done then to rectify that.
And as I was thinking earlier, I said Jane Austen. I mean, there's a lot of constant complication. I love Pride and Prejudice, one of my favorite books. I was so shocked the first time I read it, came to it pretty late, how contemporary it feels. It's like, this feels like how people really are. It's just, that's how they are. And those complications close to the end, and issues of trust. And we know the hot stuff's going to happen. It's just, afterwards. Well, I want to throw this over to Shaun. We talk about different relationships. Your novel is a coming of age story, and it's also a family saga. And in this session, another session, you kind of touched on the importance of family. So, are there metaphorical romantic relationships? Like, do you see what I'm saying? Like, are there characters who have these strong, intimate connections with other characters in their work that it's not romantic, it's not sexual, but it's intense at that level?
Yeah. There's a brother-sister relationship in the book that's incredibly close, not inappropriately so,
Right.
but
that's what I was thinking about. Yeah.
but they're sort of, the narrator has an older sister named Eunice, who is sort of a stand-in mother figure because their mom is just not able to be there for them, either physically or emotionally, the way that you obviously everyone would prefer. And so that there's definitely that, and that is something that I really do like to explore in fiction, are close relationships between, particularly it seems to manifest as men and women who aren't romantically involved, but who end up being very close. It's something that shows up in the next book as well in its own way. And I don't know what exactly it is, maybe because I've had so many good female friends as a, growing up and as an adult, like, and being, when I worked at a Barnes and Noble for 8 years, I was one of a handful of guys working at Barnes and Noble. It was mostly women on staff at the store. So I had a lot of older sister figures. I grew up in a house of women without a dad. So like, I think that that's just a subject that I seem to return to over and over again, that I think is really interesting, because there is an energy that comes along with it that isn't necessarily sexual, but that also doesn't always have an easily socially definable, at least in our society, place to be. That I don't know that I've written about it extensively, or I've got some grand statement about it in any of my books so far, but it is something that I think is on my mind a lot, and that I've had to navigate as I've gotten older, and gotten married, and want to make sure that my relationships are appropriate, and and that there is no loss of trust or anything like that. So it's interesting, and it is one of my pet obsessions, I would say.
I find that fascinating because one of my favorite movies is When Harry Met Sally, and there's that thesis in there of men and women can't be friends.
Right.
And they're friends for so much of it. And then when they sleep together, that's actually the mistake. The next, they're almost immediately, they're like, and you think that's the complication. And while I, adore the fact that they end up getting married at the end or being together and they've lived, it's wonderful and cozy. But I've always wondered, what if they were able to stay friends and it was just about their friendship, but how complicated and weird that can be. So
yeah, there's actually a movie. I mean, it's nowhere near as good as When Harry Met Sally, but it's interesting. It's called Drinking Buddies. It's got, I think, Olivia Wilde and Jake Johnson, the guy from New Girl,
okay.
Who are sort of friends. And then there is sort of, they also stumble into that romantic thing. And it's about, how do you walk back from that? Or can you walk back from that? It's not, When Harry Met Sally is a stone cold classic. So like, I'm not trying to put it on the same level, but as far as movies that sort of explore that type of relationship, that is one example that just comes to mind right away. I think the Duplass brothers might have directed it. So it's one of those mumblecore type movies. Yeah. So go in forewarned, it's that kind of movie. That's either your thing or it's not. But yeah, it is interesting. And that is sort of, I think, what makes that movie so charming isn't the fact necessarily that they get together at the end. It's how much fun we have watching them be friends for so long.
Yeah. And he starts with that just strong thesis: men and women can't be friends. And so we're not going to be friends. Okay, we're not friends. And then they end up finding each other again.
Yeah.
Well, we have a little over 15 minutes, which is great. We've got some questions, I know, from Benji, who's with us, who has like all the questions. And I know I have some other things I want to ask and follow up with you guys also, but I'd like to take a look at what we've got here. So Benji asked, so every story that is written now is supposedly a reflection upon what is happening now and a comment upon modern life. What themes, relationships, and progressions are you investigating when you write love? And I think we've started to touch on this a little bit. I know with Marlena's new work, and Piper, you bringing in what we just talked about with Sweet Tea, and we just talked about When Harry Met Sally. Is there something to add, or do you want to go to next question? Because I think that kind of almost answers that. That was an early one. Anything else you guys are kind of exploring that we haven't touched on?
Well, I just wanted to say, in terms of me going from romance to historical fiction, that the ways that it's dealt with are very different. I have had people say about my historical fiction novel by Her Own Design, which starts out with someone who becomes a child bride at 12 and having to, write rape, in effect.
Yeah, that's hard. Yeah.
It's a very different kind of way of looking at it, but people have had critique about how much of that, had to be there. And it wasn't much, but, it was like enough, so you knew what was happening and you knew about her feelings about that. At that particular, very tough.
Piper, that to me is a great topic just to at least briefly touch on here. Is for you or anybody, there is this line of whether it's romance or whether it's violence, where is the exploitation? Because I know that's a problem I think I have a lot with film, where they're trying to say something important, but this violent scene looks awfully exploitive, and it seems like it's meant to provoke an enjoyment of this violence as opposed to actually dealing with the topic. So have you guys had some issues in your writing with that, trying to strike a balance?
I've had to, so especially in She Wolf of Canta, there's a lot of human trafficking that happens specifically with women, and there's always a threat of rape in the book. I've never specifically spell it out or say that that's what's happening or anything like that, but there's always the threat there, and especially for the reader. But I never go there because I control this world. I write it the way I can write it. And historical fiction, that's the area that's tough, because you can't really evade that, because it's the world we live in. But when I write horror and fantasy, I can choose how the world's going to be, and I can control what happens in this storyline. So
that's a great answer to George R.R. Martin, who's always like, well, in the medieval times. It's like, well, that's not what you're really writing. It's fantasy. So
you can control how the world works and what story you choose to tell, so.
And to a point, with the whole thing with that particular aspect of what's historically appropriate or accurate, and that kind of thing. I've had her family come forward and say, this was the thing that occurred, and the unfortunate aspect of it is that it's relevant still, because it was only a couple of months ago that Tennessee tried to pass some kind of marriage thing, and they didn't put an age limit in it until someone stood up and said, hey, where's that line about somebody needs to be 18 years old? And they had to put that in. So it's unfortunate that these things are still out there.
Yeah. Well, Benji has another really good question, and I think we kind of slightly touched on it a little bit with Marlena's work, or the work in progress, but queerness, and that's a very broad term. It can be a very broad term. Is queerness still underrepresented or misrepresented? Probably not in your works, but I mean, do you see that in or is that an issue you've had to struggle with, or? That's a tough question, but it's a good one from Benji.
I've had friends of mine in the LGBT community who've read my Stolen series and just been so happy to see characters that are LGBT and are actually have their own storyline, have their own character development, they're not just a background character, they're main characters in the story and changing the world around them. And their romantic relationship matters. And it's causing terrible things to happen. but it's important to the plot, and you can't just erase them and the story is still there. So
Yeah, I'm very much a person to hearing it about people who should, who are from that community, write those stories. However, I have had, and it's one of my novellas, which was a historical novella about the Atlanta washerwoman strike of 1881. The founders of Spelman College, who everybody has long known were a couple. You don't get that where they're buried in the same grave and they're not, a couple, a lesbian couple, in terms of that. And I feature them in the story in terms of that. And it's such an intriguing story. I've had thoughts about trying to do more with it. And so I mean, this is this question of like, what is the deal with these two white women from the North wanting to come south and build a school for Black women? It's always a big, not a big thing, but something that I think people don't talk about enough. And so while they were more or less like Marlena, the same backdrop in my washerwoman novella, I have had thoughts about trying to do more with that particular story, but it's a part of life. And this is the thing in terms of, when you have queerness, it should be reflected more if you're writing, that kind of story. I think it's underrepresented. And in terms, at least in terms of Hallmark, they are doing more with it. But I think in terms of, they are. No, this Countdown to Christmas, there'll be a movie. And there's a book being published in the publishing line that'll also be a movie next year. With the protagonist, not just the brothers over here who are gay or whatever. There's going to be mainline representation, but it's only one. So I don't, if out of 40 movies, you need to be doing a little bit more than that.
Well, and it's interesting how genre sometimes controls that, or I don't know, maybe that's not true, but I think it's fascinating that as someone who's looking to write historical fiction, it's not like suddenly these people appeared, all these different people appeared. They've always been here and they were in history and they had impacts just maybe on ways that people didn't know about. So to write something like that is pretty powerful.
Well, when people went to go see The Woman King, they started questioning the lesbian love story. I'm like, are you kidding me? I'm like, what the hell?
Right.
You had to, especially if they're holding back from them any type of other kind of sex. Come on, you had to know that was happening. Oh, that didn't belong there because in the 1500s they weren't.
Yeah,
right. Wake up already.
So Shaun, has that been an aspect of something that you've had to explore or deal with in your work? Question of queerness, and I guess we could say it in a broad term. I mean, I would think that one of the core relationships in cosmology, in a way, could be read. I don't know.
Well, I mean, there is definitely a queer relationship in Cosmology of Monsters that is one of those aforementioned love stories that that the book sort of hangs on. So it's definitely something that is very important to me. It's something that I think we need more representation of. I think that, I absolutely feel like more queer creators need to be empowered and we need more stories. But I also feel like as a straight white male, who's terrified of getting it wrong, it's still my responsibility to at least try to get it right and to tell stories about the world the way I see it and the people I actually know versus, just people who look and sound like me. And it's something that I'm exploring even more, that comes up even more. One of the main characters, one of the point of view characters in my second book is queer. So that is something that, that I'm very excited about, but also very nervous about, just because and it was something I was very nervous about going into the publication of Cosmology. And it's been one of the most gratifying things about publishing that book is the number of queer readers I've had reach out to me who have been happy with the portrayals in that book and how that went. And I'm hoping that, that trust that I've gained, I'm, honoring that going forward with this new book. So, I know that's a lot of dancing around it, but yes, I guess. Is the
No,
answer.
it's a valid, as myself as a, I'm white cisgendered, and I want to have those because those are people I know. So I want to include that in my fiction, but you're right. You have to be very conscious of that. So sensitivity readers, does anybody employ any sensitivity readers or have beta readers that are just good at that?
I will be using one on this new book. We haven't gotten there yet, but that's actually something my publisher is paying for, which is really nice.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. If they didn't, I would be happy to, but they volunteered and I was like, yeah, you guys do it. Go ahead. I'll let you.
Great. That's great.
So it's definitely something that is important to me. And as I was writing the book, this second book, I specifically for the queer romance, I was, I made sure to speak to queer friends and ask questions. And, I've been a little too shy to actually show it to anybody who wasn't my agent or editor so far, but before it goes to publication, I'm sure I will make the rounds after it gets through the sensitivity readers just one more time to make sure.
It does involve doing the work. And this is the thing. You have to do the work and not expect. This is why I'm kind of like sensitivity reader kind of. And sensitivity readers, it's for a lot of people who are not willing to do the work, is more like an affirmation about, yay, aren't you great? You did everything right, kind of thing. And it can't be that. You have
Right.
to
It has
allow
to be somebody who's a real critic of your work.
Yeah.
Well, a real critic of the work, but have the author receive the criticism is what I'm saying. The criticism doesn't get received. It's more as if the sensitivity reader is there to say you did a wonderful job.
Yeah.
That's not what it's about. So as long as you have somebody who's willing to do the work and the person is willing to receive the criticism, that's what the real task is.
Yeah.
That is an excellent point. Marlena, did you?
Yeah, I was just going to add, regardless of whether you get a sensitivity reader or not, you should do the research and treat it like you would any other detailed research topic. You dig into it, you find communities, because there's lots of communities that help you to write characters that are more diverse. You just have to find them and adhere to them and ask people. If you don't know people in person, reach out to people in communities online, and find out what they say, find out what they think about what your approach is, and ideally do that before you even start writing, because that may form your whole novel or your whole book series.
That's an excellent point, to start with research. That's anything, but especially something difficult. Well,
Yeah.
So I love the fact that we started with let's talk some spicy sex scenes. That's what this is all about. And I think we've really gotten into some important, deep issues with genre, with character, with plot structure, with market forces, and also your audience. So informing craft. So this has been fantastic. I'd like to know what y'all are working on right now. So we could do kind of a two-part, because some people have already talked about things they're working on. So we'll do two different questions. You have a choice, or you could do both. What are you reading or watching? And it can connect with our topic or not, but it's that you think is really good. And what would you like to promote of your work? So we're going to start with Marlena.
Oh boy. I'm really slow at watching TV. There's like 5 shows I want to watch right now. Just watched Hocus Pocus 2, which was a lot of fun. As far as reading, I'm partway through The Toll by Sherry Priest, which is very gothic horror and has a lot of really interesting environmental pieces to it. It's very Lovecraftian too, which is a lot of fun.
Wow.
As far as what I'm promoting right now, what I'm working on, I just had book 3 of my Wolves of Canta series come out. That just came out last month. I'm in an anthology that just came out this last week, Emporium of Superstition, which is all women horror authors. And then at the end of the month, I have an anthology I've got a story in called Catstruck, which is a cat charity anthology, and all the proceeds go to 10th Live Cat Rescue. And that's going to be coming out, I think, around Halloween, a few days before. So yeah, it's a busy month.
Oh, that's awesome. That's great.
Thank you.
Shaun, what are you reading, watching? What would you like to promote?
So ever since the Netflix Sandman hit, I've been on kind of a Neil Gaiman Sandman kick. I just finished rereading all of the graphic novels. And now I'm kind of getting into some of the spin-off stuff that other writers have done. Just like, I just can't get enough of that world. I'm also doing the Audible versions which are amazing. If you love the Sandman or haven't encountered it, the Audible versions with James McAvoy as the Sandman are pretty fantastic. They're pretty much note perfect reproductions of the comics. So that's kind of like that's my ADHD hyper, fixation kind of thing that's been going on. But it's also informing the thing I'm working on. And I feel like I'm learning a lot from revisiting these stories. And there's an expansiveness of vision there that's just amazing. As far as promoting, unfortunately, I still only have the one book to promote, which is A Cosmology of Monsters, which you can get pretty much wherever you like to get your books. So if you haven't checked it out, please do. And hopefully my next one will be out. I'm hoping for next year. We'll see how the editing schedule pans out. So keep your fingers crossed for me.
Yeah, and definitely you can get our authors' books at Foxtail. It's our conference bookstore. So check those out. Piper, you're going to have our last word. What are you watching, reading, and what would you like to promote?
I think I finished binging the Gordita Chronicles on HBO Max. It's a delightful series about that little teenage Latina girl coming from the Dominican Republic with her family and their adjustment to America. It's very sad. There's not going to be any more episodes. They canceled it practically right out the gate. They didn't even give it a chance, And it's the kind of thing that makes me wish I knew how to write YA, but I don't. So yeah, the only thing I can offer up is, my By Her Own Design book about Angela, a Black fashion designer, and who designed Jackie Kennedy's wedding dress, amongst many other things for Vanderbilt's, Rockefellers, and DuPont's, all kinds of women. I'm working on American Daughters, which will be my next historical fiction about the interracial friendship between Portia Washington, the daughter of Booker T. Washington, and Alice Roosevelt, the daughter of Theodore Roosevelt. And Alice was a hedonist, so there's going to be like some amped up sex in this one when it comes out next year.
So we'll have you back to talk more about Sexy Time.
I've had to adjust myself with this work in progress. So
well, this has been a blast. I knew it was going to be fun, but it was even more fun. Thank you so much. We had a great conversation here. Y'all's books are awesome, and I look forward to seeing what you're going to be doing in the future. Those of you who attended, thank you so much for attending. And we're going to be a short break, and our next session will be coming up shortly. Y'all take care. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank y'all.